Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao are two of the most influential and best boxers of all time. They were the two best welterweights in the world from 2008 all the way to 2015. But it took 7 years for them to finally fight, and for a lot of people it's a clear demonstration of everything wrong with modern boxing. However, there is a lot of discourse, and there has been for a long time, about who was ducking who. Since both Mayweather and Pacquiao have gathered massive fan bases, the Pacquiao fans will say that Mayweather was ducking Pacquiao, and the Mayweather fans will say that Pacquiao was ducking Mayweather. So if you're a new fan to the sport, it can be difficult to figure out who was actually in the wrong in this situation, because boxing fans can be very tribal. So I'm here to give, to the best of my ability, the most unbiased, honest and genuine breakdown of what happened. The timeline from 2008 to 2015, each stage of negotiation and what happened and who was in the wrong in each case. The first time that Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao were in the same weight class at the same time was in December of 2008. Pacquiao had just jumped up 2 weight divisions at once, from 135 to 147, to face Oscar De La Hoya, who Pacquiao would stop in the 8th round. Mayweather had been at welterweight since 2005, and his most recent win was a knockout over Ricky Hatton. However, Floyd Mayweather would announce his retirement after beating Hatton. He gave up his titles, so the Pacquiao fight was not on the cards. But obviously we know that Mayweather would return eventually. Pacquiao would then face Floyd's most recent opponent, Ricky Hatton, and he knocked out Hatton in the 2nd round, outperforming Mayweather. And at this point he was widely regarded as the pound for pound best fighter in the world. Assuming Mayweather was no longer retired, it would be number 1 versus number 2 in the world. Floyd eventually announced his return versus Juan Manuel Marquez and would pitch a complete shutout, outboxing Marquez for 12 rounds. It may be the best performance of his career. What made this even more impressive is that Marquez by this point had fought Pacquiao twice, the first fight being a draw, the second fight being a close win for Pacquiao. So for Floyd to win in that manner was a statement. Pacquiao would then take on Miguel Cotto, who he'd outbox and stop in the 12th round. And at this point, for the first time, Mayweather and Pacquiao would enter negotiations. From this point onwards the video gets a bit complicated, so listen closely, especially if you've already made your mind up about who is ducking who before watching the whole video. By December, Manny Pacquiao had signed a contract to face Floyd Mayweather on March the 13th, 2010 as a 50-50 split. This is one of the only times in their negotiations where there's no disagreement about the purse splits, about the venue. Most of the conditions are met quite seamlessly, until a month later Bob Arum, Pacquiao's promoter, had announced that the fight was off. The issue with making the fight was entirely down to a drug testing dispute. Both sides had agreed to the urine testing, but Mayweather insisted on Olympic-style random blood testing. Pacquiao was reluctant to accept any blood testing, but he'd accept 3 specific conditions. If Pacquiao wanted his blood to be tested, he only wanted it tested 3 times. The first would be 2 months away from the fight, the second would be at least a month away from the fight, and the third would be straight after the fight. Keeping in mind that the most essential part of drug testing takes place in the 2 weeks before the fight, so Pacquiao was trying to avoid it. But Mayweather put his foot down and insisted he wanted blood testing 2 weeks away from the fight. Bob Arum continued to push the idea of Pacquiao taking those 3 drug tests, but Floyd would not accept any deals where Pacquiao was not being drug tested 14 days away, which was reasonable considering he himself would be tested the same way. But Pacquiao and his team would not accept it. This did raise a lot of eyebrows because Pacquiao was someone who started his career at 105 pounds and he was now fighting at 147. That's 10 whole weight classes of difference, and he'd recently just jumped up 2 weight divisions at the same time to face De La Hoya. So now there were suspicions about PEDs being attributed to this, and that's the same sentiment that Team Mayweather had, publicly claiming that Pacquiao was on PEDs. The excuse that Pacquiao and his team gave for not accepting the blood testing was that Manny hates needles. His trainer Freddie Roach went on to say on record, "If we had given in on the blood testing, it would have been like giving Mayweather the first round. Why would we do that?" Manny hates needles. He said that's what cost him the first Eric Morales fight. The last time that Pacquiao took a loss, we made a mistake on that one. Manny gave blood the night before the fight, which made him weaker. So even if Manny took blood 14 days from the fight, that's 2-3 days of missing training. So ultimately, the fight negotiations were over, and Pacquiao was searching for a new opponent. In my opinion, this is a case of Pacquiao ducking Floyd. Even if it is true that Pacquiao was weaker 3 days after giving blood, I don't think that's a good enough excuse to completely avoid the biggest fight in boxing. I do think that Pacquiao was willing to face Mayweather in this situation, he just didn't want to agree to those stipulations. And if the stipulations aren't too ridiculous, I think it is ducking. Pacquiao would then face Joshua Clottey instead on the 13th, and Floyd would go on to face Shane Mosley. Pacquiao beats Clottey by decision and Floyd beats Mosley by decision. Half a year after the initial negotiations fell through, Pacquiao takes a U-turn and actually agrees on the 14-day blood testing. With the new stipulations, Team Pacquiao had a new offer to offer Team Mayweather. And the way they saw it, if there was no testing dispute, Floyd should be eager to take the fight. So Floyd was given a deadline to accept the deal. Top Rank was very public about this and even gave a countdown on their public website. However, one thing that needs to be considered in this situation is that Bob Arum never disclosed the actual conditions of the contracts. So there could be unfair stipulations against Floyd on the contracts, but we don't know about it. Floyd, however, simply ignores the deadline and doesn't accept it, staying concerningly silent throughout this whole thing. The only person on Mayweather's team to break the silence was his manager, Leonard Ellaby, who claims there were actually no negotiations at all, and that Team Pacquiao was lying about it. Luckily, there was actually an unbiased party to weigh in on this. HBO president Ross Greenberg was actually there in negotiations. That took place between Bob Arum and Leonard Ellaby, essentially confirming that Team Mayweather was lying about there being no negotiations. But Ellaby insists that there was no negotiation. In light of this, Pacquiao instead moves up again to face Antonio Margarito, who Pacquiao would batter for 12 rounds. Mayweather would knock out Victor Ortiz, Pacquiao would beat Shane Mosley, and then beat Marquez again in the trilogy, after a controversial decision. By this point, Manny and Floyd's paths would cross again. In January 2012, Mayweather calls out Pacquiao publicly on Twitter to make the fight in Las Vegas on May the 5th. There was a slight complication with this. Floyd had an upcoming sentence after a domestic violence charge, but Floyd insisted it would not affect the fight if it took place in June. Floyd even managed to postpone the jail sentence so he could take the fight, but there was a bit of reluctance on Pacquiao's part. Bob Arum states that Pacquiao needs more time to recover after suffering a cut in his last fight versus Marquez, even though cuts do not take 4 months to heal, but then changing his excuse, saying the fight should not take place in the MGM Grand, because they intended on building a larger stadium just for the fight, which would have made more revenue on ticket sales. For whatever reason though, every time Bob Arum is questioned about negotiations, he seems to disregard the idea of Floyd being a potential opponent and looking into other options instead. For whatever reason, Bob Arum is reluctant to negotiate with Team Mayweather, but Pacquiao himself seems more open, as Floyd and Pacquiao would actually have a private phone call to negotiate the fight. But what Floyd revealed from that phone call is that he only offered Pacquiao $40 million for the fight. That may seem like a large enough number, but $40 million is a flat fee and does not include pay-per-views. So while Pacquiao could be making $40 million, Floyd would be making $200. Which was not right considering the fight was 50-50. And by this point the general public becomes fed up of these games. Mayweather consistently makes up these stipulations and poor purse splits, which makes it seem like he's either weaseling his way out of the fight or simply weasel his way into as much money as possible, which in return means the fight won't happen unless Pacquiao takes a one-sided contract. So both fighters would move on. Floyd would take on Miguel Cotto and win by decision, whereas Pacquiao would take on rising contender Tim Bradley Jr., who would actually end up beating Pacquiao by controversial decision. Pacquiao would lose a fight for the first time since 2005, and this definitely threw a potential spanner in the works for the Mayweather fight. But no spanner would be as damaging as the result of Pacquiao's next fight, as he takes the quadrilogy with Marquez to finally settle the rivalry. Marquez would knock Pacquiao out cold, meaning he's now lost 2 in a row, and his stock would completely plummet. This definitely put the Floyd negotiations to ice, because in this position there were more lucrative fights for Floyd at this point. Because Pacquiao could no longer sell the way he was before, Floyd would instead take on the next best star in boxing, super welterweight champion Canelo Alvarez, who Floyd would dominate over 12 rounds, followed by taking on a surging Marcos Maidana. It would turn out to be a very close fight which warranted a rematch, so they did, and this time Floyd wins the fight more convincingly. Meanwhile, Pacquiao would get a win over Brandon Rios and then get his revenge versus Tim Bradley Jr. This meant that once again Pacquiao was a champion, so now order had somewhat been reset. Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather were the number 1 and 2 welterweights in the world. And if the fight wasn't to happen now, it would never take place, ever. They'd re-enter negotiations for what seems like the 5th time, until they eventually agreed on a deal, so the fight was made official for the first time on May the 2nd, 2015. The fight would break records and be the best-selling pay-per-view in combat sports history. Ultimately, it would be a slightly disappointing fight, where Mayweather won by unanimous decision. And that puts an end to the Manny Pacquiao vs Floyd Mayweather saga, one of the most frustrating wastes of potential in boxing history. I think to answer the question who ducked who, they both ducked each other in separate parts of negotiations. I think they were both always willing to take the fight, but in each case of the fight falling through, there was always some disadvantage for either Floyd or Pacquiao. If the disadvantage was on Floyd's side, Floyd would refuse. If it was on Pacquiao's side, Pacquiao would refuse. Manny opted out of the fight when blood testing was first negotiated, and Floyd opted out twice himself. First was when Bob Arum set the deadline and ignored it because the deal was not in his favour, and then priced himself out of the fight a couple years later by only offering Pacquiao $40 million. So technically Floyd ducks him twice and Pacquiao did it once. But overall, if either fighter really wanted the fight, they would take it anyway. I think a good example is when Usyk took the first fight versus Fury. Fury was making silly demands like 70-30 in his favour, a bigger ring, no rematch clause in his favour. Usyk took the fight anyway with those stipulations because he knew he was going to win the fight, and it's not completely about the money. If either Floyd or Pacquiao just took the loss on negotiations, accepted a worse deal for a few million less, the fight could have easily been made. Very similar to the Spence-Crawford negotiations, where they both demanded to be the A side. But either way, that's how history played out. I think either way Floyd would have beaten Pacquiao in 2011, 2008, 2013, either time. But it certainly would have been a much more entertaining fight if it took place earlier. And that's going to do it for the video. Like and subscribe, leave a comment. Goodbye.